I just, I just, I just speak my peace, keep my peace.
What's good, everybody? Welcome to episode 94 of the Speak My Peace podcast. As always, I'm your gracious host, Greg Lacey. Like we always do about this time, I do hope that this episode reaches you all in good health, that you're all still taking the proper precautions to take care of yourselves, take care of your physical, your mental, all that good stuff. If this is your first time listening to the Speak My Peace podcast, welcome. If this is not, welcome back. I appreciate you all tuning in. Whether it's your first time, second time, third time, no matter what the frequency is, I can't stress enough how important you all continue to tune into this podcast is. To my YouTube viewers, what's good to my YouTube viewers? I definitely appreciate your viewership. We're a growing community on YouTube, and I definitely appreciate you all that tune into the podcast on YouTube. To get into before we get into everything, I do want to start this episode off by saying last week, I was kind of like stumbling on words, mixed for words, and trying to express the exact emotion or sentiment that I felt in regards to the death of George Floyd. And the word I ended up choosing was appreciative, and I felt like that just wasn't the best choice of word. Like I almost re-recorded last week's episode. I almost released on second thought episode last week just because that word just didn't sit right with me as the week progressed, because I felt like that word appreciative, it tells the story that, in order for this man's life to be celebrated, he had to die, which shouldn't have been the case. Like his life should have been celebrated regardless. And it was very unfortunate. I guess the best way to label that was like a grateful misfortune. Like I'm definitely grateful of the rewards that came from it. But even saying that, it's like misconstrued, and it kind of sound ill-willed because, here we are reaping the benefits, and here's a man who lost his life. Here's a child that lost their father. So I guess there's really no word to describe it, but I hope that you all get, what message I was trying to get across and explaining that. As you all see, a week later, I still can't really express the exact label, express the exact sentiment, express the exact feeling that I was feeling in regards to the aftermath of George Floyd dying. And I probably will never be able to, but I definitely, my point in getting that across was just, I was trying to relay how I felt and the things that happened in the aftermath of that, if that makes any sense. With that being said, to get into this week's episode, it's not going to be a long one. As most of you may know, most of you may not know, just because the history was hidden for so long, it's still hidden now. This past weekend, leading into this week, marks 100 years since the fire in Little Africa, also known as the Tulsa Massacre, that occurred from May 31st, 1921 to June 1st, 1921. The backstory, for those of you who don't know, and a small sample size, is essentially there was a thriving community in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. And in a matter of, I believe, 16 hours, it was burned to the ground. And this was a result of racism, to no surprise. And I'm going to take you along my ride and how I feel and how we got to there, but just in a small sample size, this is essentially what it was. It was racism carried out. It was racist attacks carried out in a thriving Black neighborhood that erased the identity of one of probably the most affluent neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods in all of America. Still, even to this day, that remains true. So I guess to take you all to just that moment, the reason why I'm using this episode to tell this story, and I may get some things wrong and I don't know the whole story, is because of, this is another reason why I started this podcast. It's definitely Black stories that need to be shared. That's not shared enough. It's definitely Black stories that aren't covered at all that people should be more aware of. I understand the majority of my audience is Black, but we do we definitely cross international borders, and we definitely cross ethnicities and different backgrounds. And so I hope that me using this platform to bring light to this um, opens up another world, or opens up um, the window or the mind of people who never heard of it. Even a lot of Black people have never heard of the story, and I think that that's sad. But essentially, the reason why I want to use this episode to cover this is because although this was 100 years ago, although this was on American soil, although this is the most horrendous massacre on American soil, it's not covered. It's not talked about. And in order for you to find documents, in order for you to find a history on it, you have to do a lot of deep searching, just because of America did what America does, and that's basically erase that part of history. Just like America, agrees that slavery was such a terrible thing, but America denies its wrongdoing and participating in slavery. So to take y'all back to Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921, I got to first take y'all through how we got there. So the first Black people, African American people, Negroes, whatever term is the best for this story, arrived in Tulsa, Oklahoma with indigenous or Native Americans. This was as a result of the Trail of Tears. And y'all have to, another reason why I don't cover history too much on this podcast outside of Black history is because I don't know history. Like, I went to school, I went to high school, passed high school, graduated college, and all that good stuff. But American history does not excite me. I don't retain information in American history. I don't remember dates of American history unless it's like really pertinent. Like, you can't forget about 9/11 because we labeled it 9/11. It was terrorist attacks, but it's labeled 9/11. But like, other than that, I don't remember dates too well. And so y'all had to forgive me for leaving out years and messing up time frames if I do try to cover in this episode. But to take y'all back to what I was speaking about, the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was the displacements of Indian or Native American people when American settlers, were successfully stealing land from the Native people of America and then displacing them all throughout America. And so the Trail of Tears symbolizes those Native Americans being forced out of their native lands and forced to go live or inhabitate specific areas that these new American settlers have forced them to. And these Trail of Tears led to many places. I believe a lot of them went to Missouri, some went to Oklahoma, some went to Arkansas, some went to, and it was displaced in many different places. But we're going to focus on Oklahoma for the sake of this podcast and for the sake of this episode. So Native Americans, they enslaved African Americans in an attempt to, I guess, mimic the ways of these new settlers in America. They mimicked, their lifestyles and what they were doing. And as a result, our people were enslaved by indigenous people. And so the first settler of Black people in Oklahoma came as enslaved people with these Native Americans who were now displaced to Oklahoma. Again, I don't remember the time frame of this, but just know that, this happened. I believe it was the 1800s. I could be wrong. I believe the Trail of Tears happened in like the early 1800s. So this is the settlement of the first Black people. Fast forward to the Civil War. At the conclusion of the Civil War, a lot of free Black people settled in Oklahoma. And so now we had these displaced Native Americans who were forced out of their native lands in Oklahoma, as well as these African Americans who had just fought for the country and was promised freedom after the conclusion of the war. Had they won, were now also placed and cohabitating with these indigenous people in Oklahoma. Fast forward to like 1820s. I believe the date was like 1827. Here comes in the Dawes Act. And the Dawes Act basically broke down these settlements of these indigenous people where they were just once forced. They then broke it down and then were, handing plots to individuals who cohabitated within these areas. So in Oklahoma, you have these indigenous people and you have these free black people cohabitating in Oklahoma. They're now being given plots of land as a result of the Dawes Act. You asked me what the Dawes Act is. I don't exactly know what the Dawes Act is, but I know that was a result of the Dawes Act. People were given plots of land. When we think of the promise of the 40 acres and a mule, this was like the first inkling of that, or the first example of that. And so this is like the 1820s. So now we have free black people in Oklahoma who own plots of land, who are now thriving and just building up a community and inviting more people like them into this community. Fast forward hundreds of years, the First World War comes, and it's the same result. Black people, they come back home. There's no difference from, racism still going on, segregation still going on. There's no difference from the world from when they left and when they came back. They're still facing the same evils that, reside in this country. However, you have a place like Oklahoma where people that look like them are thriving. They have land. They're opening up businesses, and it seems like a promising place. So now a lot of people who were once from Oklahoma and people who've never been to Oklahoma before are now settled in Oklahoma. So now you're bringing in more, influential people within these areas. And then you have segregation, you have racism. Again, this is America. And so these people, they're forced into certain areas within Tulsa, Oklahoma. Think about, episode, I believe it was 65, where we covered redlining. And this was the first example of that. Black people were allowed to come back into Oklahoma and able to, create businesses and create this community and live, by each other. However, they weren't allowed in certain spots of the city. And certain spots of the city included downtown, where most of the businesses were. And so these black people were forced into, I believe it was the south side of Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the Greenwood district. And so now you have this community of black people. Obviously, they don't have the resources that they would like. They don't have the opportunities that they would like. They don't have all the other things that are available in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma in their district. And so as many black people do, black people are very good in making the best out of nothing. And so what these people in this community did was build this community from the ground up. And so they began to create businesses. They began to generate and accumulate wealth within this district by keeping the dollar to themselves. They're not going, because they weren't allowed in these downtown districts, because it wasn't allowed in the downtown and north side and other parts of Tulsa. They kept the money flow within that district, that Greenwood district. And this allowed them to open up many, many, many businesses within that country. They had barbershops, they had salons, they had doctor's offices, they had lawyers, they had dentists, they had restaurants, they had jewelers, they had theater. They had a 700-seat theater, the Dreamland Theater. There's many places today in 2021 that can't fit 700 people. However, they had a 700-seat theater in 1921. They had taverns, they had pool hall, they had movie houses, they had grocers, all these many things. And they were able to build up this district and create this system to where all the money that they were spending We're going to people that look like them. We're going to their neighbors, and it was all, staying within their community, building their community up, making them more wealthy, feeding each other, and things like that. And so you have this, as a result of that, you have this very, very affluent, very, very wealthy district of Black people. Yeah, Black people who represents upper echelon. For those of you who don't know, Booker T. Washington, the famous, one of the most famous educators, Black or white, he came down here and he experienced something that he said he even couldn't explain how important what was going on in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the time when he visited Tulsa, Oklahoma, was to the rest of the country. He said that they laid out the blueprint for the rest of the country to create wealthy and affluent communities. Then at that time is when he coined the term Negro Wall Street, which we call Black Wall Street today, Greenwood District. And it was something that just had never been seen before. To put it in perspective, around this time, it was an estimated 600 businesses in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Today, and that was 1921. Today, 100 years later, there are, I think the number was 35 Black-owned businesses in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So just think of that. It's putting everything into perspective. You have this one district where people were forced into. They couldn't, live outside of that district. They couldn't necessarily shop, eat, or enjoy life outside of that district. And they had all these businesses, all Black-owned. And today, 100 years later, that same district doesn't even have a quarter of the businesses they had 100 years ago. I don't know too many areas where that would be true. Like 100 years is a long time. And the reason why I even give you all these numbers is to show just how thriving a community Tulsa, Oklahoma, this Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma was back then. Another reason why I bring that up is because think about, we think about generational wealth. We speak about generational wealth within our people a lot. I guess I shouldn't really speak on that now, but the reason why I bring up generational wealth is because, these are things that can be passed down to children, nephews, nieces, grandchildren, things like this. When you have an affluent community like this, when you have a thriving community like this, of people that look like you, and things are kept within your family, it's easy to, when you transition in life, to pass it on to someone in your lineage. So this is the scene. I set the scene for you all for what this looked like prior to this day. So all this happened, I painted this picture of this beautiful city with these beautiful people, wealthy people taking care of each other. Something that we still have struggled with something we still have struggles with creating today, even with all the resources we have. And then on the day of May 30th, there was a shoe shiner, a young black shoe shiner who happened to work in the downtown district. He shined the shoes of like many wealthy white people. And during his time, during his shifts, he would enter, I don't know if it was a movie theater, I don't know exactly what the building was, but he would enter in this building to use a restroom, during his breaks while he was working downtown. And one day this is the story, I should say, no one knows the exact facts of what happened, but what is believed to have happened and what many people recount the story of being is that this black shoe shiner, he was walking into the elevator. Back then they had elevator operators. And so the elevator operator in this building was a young white girl who he's made acquaintance with many a times, who I've seen many a times, as I said, as he's working downtown, he frequently, goes in this building to use a restroom. And so from the stories I read and the accounts that I've heard, he was entering in the elevator and he happened to stumble or trip. And as he's stumbling, he braces himself on the fall by grabbing the white girl who operates the elevator as he's entering the elevator. Just something that's a human reaction. If you're tripping, you're going to brace yourself with whatever sturdy around you. And at that time, in that moment, this young man braced himself with the human that was in front of him. As he braced himself by grabbing this white woman, and it's not nothing sexually from what I believe. He just happened to just grab her. I don't know if it was grabbing her arms, grabbing, her shoulders, grabbing whatever the case may be. He grabbed her to brace himself, and she screams. As she screams, there are other white men in the building who hear the screams, and the shoe shiner who understands what's going on and understands what the optics look like, he escapes. He leaves the building and he runs because they then begin to accuse him of sexual assault. Any black man in their right mind in that situation would do the same. I don't know too many who wouldn't. All right, so he escapes. The next day, there is an article published in the Tulsa newspaper that says, "Nab Negro for assaulting white girl." The next day, police arrive at his home. They arrest him, take him down to the county jail. There's rumors speculating around the city. I believe this was also published in a newspaper that as a result of this, they were planning to lynch this man. And remember when I was speaking about the first black people settling and the evolution of the black people who arrived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a lot of the black men who were in Tulsa, Oklahoma were veterans at this time. This is 1921, so there was a lot of World War I veterans. A lot of them, had access to weapons. A lot of them were armed. And again, this is a thriving community. This is a community of black people who fend for each other and who took care of each other. And so when this word gets out, there are World War I veterans who marched down to the jailhouse to protect this young man's safety, to ensure that he's not removed from that prison, to ensure that he's not lynched. And so, these veterans marched down to this police department to protect him. And this on the opposite side of them is this angry white mob who was also arriving there to, remove this man from his jail cell and to publicly lynch him. And to give you all the backstory on, the reasons for the black man believing to, even march down there to protect this young man's life, because they believe it was 2 days before it was reported that there was a white man that was lynched by the same mob. So still painting you all the scene, painting you all the picture of what the surroundings look like. You have, on one side, you have these trained veterans who, served in World War I, and you have this angry mob who has no experience with probably weapons at all, probably were farmers, probably were, I don't know, who cares what they were, probably just the average Joe. So these white men, these racist white men, this angry white mob on this side is obviously threatened by the sight of arriving somewhere and not being allowed to carry out an act that they wanted to carry out because they see that this young man has protection. So as the scene unfolds outside of this police department, one of these white men in this crowd approaches one of the veterans and asks them, why they are armed and what they intend to do and blah, blah, blah. And the accounts that I've heard, many different accounts I've heard from survivors and descendants of survivors, is that this veteran, this black man, responded that I tend to use it if I need to. And so this further threatens, this mob and further threatens that man. So the man who's confronting this black man attempts to wrestle the weapon from this black man, and he doesn't succeed in doing so. However, during this tussle, a shot lets off. Obviously, they're tussling over a gun. You have a trigger. It's bound to happen. Once a shot lets off, it hits one of the white bystanders nearby. And this is just when everything unfolds. Somehow, that shot threatened the white supremacy that existed in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so everyone retreated to their respective sides, and somehow all hell broke loose. This is when the massacre begins. White people retreat to their sides. They get backings by the police. The police deputizes over 500 people, 500 white people in the area. For those of you who don't know what deputized mean, it means basically to allow them to act as police in this setting. So now you have armed white men, you have armed black men, and it's two sides clashing, two sides colliding, and they both have armor, or they both have weapons. And so now you have gunfire involved, and this brings along casualty. Lives are claimed. One side of black people who are protecting themselves and protecting this young man, and then you have these white supremacists on this side who supremacy they feel like is threatened because of you have this thriving community, you have this community who was backing this young man, and you have just all these things that mentally just doesn't sit well with them. One thing I want y'all to also remember around this time is that the instance in which this young lady falsely accused this man of assault, sexual assault, is something that's not out of the norm. It was a tactic that was used a lot, especially in the Jim Crow era in the South. It was like, a white woman screamed sexual assault. Now this white mob has a reason to publicly lynch one of these black men. And it was something that played out many times. One of the most graphic ones that we've seen, one of the most graphic accounts that we know of, it played out with Emmett Till. So fast forward, getting back into the story of Tulsa. So now you have both sides exchange of fire. You have lies claimed and all these things. But now you have one side that's backed by law enforcement. You have one side that's backed by all these resources that exist outside of this Greenwood district. You got to remember that, black people were forced into one district. And I believe this district consisted of maybe like 30 blocks. And then you have this whole city of Tulsa, Oklahoma that they're fighting against. They're literally protecting these 30 blocks against however big the radius of Tulsa, Oklahoma is. And it's a fight that you're set up to lose. But they definitely fought to maintain. But as they're fighting, exchanging gunfire and lives are being lost, I guess this side of the angry white supremacy mob feels like they had to take it up another notch. They had to take it up another level. And so now they retreat to further outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, because they have resources of sharecroppers and pilots and things outside of Tulsa and nearby cities. And so now you have airplanes involved. There was reports from many survivors and many descendants of survivors who reports that there were also, planes flying over the city, dropping bombs and shooting guns. And it's a terrible scene to even think about. One thing that I love in current times and current media is that this scene is being depicted. I remember I was watching The Watchmen on HBO, and one of the first, or actually the first scene of the first episode of The Watchmen, it depicts what they believe for that day to have been like for a young black family and a young black man. Same thing with Lovecraft Country. I believe it's episode 9. They also depict what it is like for a survivor or a descendant of a survivor to recount what that day looked like. Granted, both of these are fiction stories, but just the display of, them trying to portray or them trying to carry out what that may have looked like, I feel like it's exactly what I expected to look like. And so the reason why I bring up the airplanes, you may ask, how, what's the symbolism? Because I opened this up by saying Little Africa's on fire and how it's on fire. You have airplanes flying over the city, dropping bombs, tearing down this 30 block radius of the 600 businesses I just told you about. So now you have these businesses all blowing up, blown to smithereens, down to the most minuscule level as possible. You have an entire city on fire. You have dead bodies in the street. You have all these things, the culmination of all these things, and this all occurred for a matter of 16 hours. You have history, you have legacies, you have wealth, you have identities, all erased within 16 hours as a result of this false accusation and this threat to white supremacy. The reason why I share the story is because, and I don't know where you all at mentally listening to me tell this recant of the stories that I've heard, the stories that I've read, but just thinking about that, the symbolism, and thinking about that scene being carried out, it sounds like hell, and it sounds like something no one will ever want to go through, but it happened, and somehow America gets away with not telling that story. America gets away with omitting that from the history books, and it's unfortunate, but it's not the only instance, not the only occurrence that has happened. I remember, being very young and seeing on TV this movie called Rosewood, starring Ving Rhames. And granted, Rosewood is like loosely based on the actual account, but then me growing up and actually finding out that Rosewood was based on something that happened real. This was another massacre that happened. Thinking about the fire in Chicago in 1919, I believe this was like a week-long massacre that happened then. I remember hearing about what happened in Detroit was another thing. And it's like, as many occurrences, and this is not the only event. This was just the one that is probably covered the most, or one that a lot of people take to just because of what was erased in. But all these cities, all these states, all these occurrences, all these massacres erase history of our people, erase identities of our people, erase lineages of our people. Dr. Michael Eric Dyson said it best, and I'm gonna read this quote that I read, is that stories like this are a valuable weapon against the amnesia that clogs the veins of American culture. And what I'd say from that just is that, America conveniently can erase our history. America can conveniently omit their wrongdoings and things like slavery and things like race massacres. They can conveniently do so. And the telling of these stories and the continuance and the remembrance and the accounts and the firsthand accounts, especially from survivors, it allows us to continue to share hope for our people. Granted, a lot of these things are tragic. Granted, a lot of these things, you don't want to recount. But you have to understand that this thing only happened 100 years ago. There are still survivors of this event. There are people that are living with this every day. That's PTSD. I remember watching a documentary earlier with this woman. I think she's like 97 years old. She's not 97 years old because she wouldn't have been around. She was 107 years old, and it was another one that was 97, but it was like 10 years ago when she heard the story. But the one that I am speaking about, she was 107 years old, and she said it's not a day that go by that she don't think about it. She said she can't not think about it. She can't not think about seeing bodies laid out on the ground. She cannot think about smelling the smoke and the ashes and think of things like the city. Think of this how horrendous this scene was, and people had to live through that, and people had to carry on with their lives. A lot of people were displaced. We think about how Black people got to Oklahoma in the first place was because they were displaced. And so now they were displaced to other areas. There were some people that stayed. There were tents that was provided by the Red Cross after the result of all this. And a lot of people stayed in tents for months until they were able to build back up their businesses or build back up their home. And this is another instance to show that, the strength of Black people, taking, what we got and making the best of it, even though what we got is always, the bottom of the barrel. This just goes to show the strength of our people. This goes to show how great our people are. It goes to show how resilient our people are. Despite all this, despite the city being wiped out, there were people who stayed around to rebuild certain things. And that is the best part. And there's a lot of things I miss in the story. I didn't want to make this an hour-long episode, but that is one of the best parts about this story is the resilience. Thinking about how terrible that scene was. Think about how terrible, how these horrendous acts may have, taken the lives of people, or how may have ran people out of the city. And despite all that, there were people who stayed around to rebuild what was once there. That is the beauty of my people, and I am extremely proud of that. Um, and the main reason why I'm proud of that is because of generational wealth. We think about all these businesses that were, alive and thriving in the height of Black Wall Street. A lot of it was erased. And so it's not able to be passed down to a child, then passed down to a grandchild, and then passed down to a great grandchild, as we see happen with these other people in their communities and in their businesses. We know what nepotism is. We know what nepotism looked like. These people weren't allowed those opportunities because it was erased because of some idiots. White supremacy was threatened. It's a terrible story, and I'd be remiss if I don't say that every time I think about it. But the fact that this was even a thing, the fact that this community even existed, it goes to show what our future look like in this country. This is why I continue to press about, us relying upon ourselves, us bigging up ourselves, us protecting ourselves, us supporting ourselves, because no one else is going to do it. They didn't do it 100 years ago. They didn't do it 200 years ago. They didn't do it 300 years ago. They didn't do it 400 years ago. In 2021 and beyond, the only way we are going to be able to achieve anything in this country, the only way we are going to, pick ourselves by our bootstraps, so the saying goes, is if we continue to support our people and build up our people and build up our communities. Because that Negro Wall Street is a possibility. Again, here today, times 1,000 now with the resources we have. And the only thing that's stopping us from doing that is ourselves. Yes, there are a lot of things that may prevent us from owning land. There may be a lot of things that may prevent us from owning businesses, but none of this is impossible. Because if anything was impossible, it was impossible for this community to have existed 100 years ago, especially with the resources they didn't have back then. And they took what they had and they built up this affluent community, this thriving community. And it was so successful that in the first, opportunity that the local people who forced them into this district, forced them within this 30-block radius, the first opportunity they had to erase that, they didn't hesitate to do it. That goes to show you how important it is. I spoke about this when we were speaking about Fred Hampton. If it's not threatening white supremacy, I mean, you can value something, you can tell how much value something has in regards to Black people by seeing how much of a threat it causes to white supremacy. We've seen that with Fred Hampton, we've seen that with Martin Luther King, we've seen that here with the Negro Wall Street. We see that in modern day sports with LeBron James. We see that in modern day sports with Colin Kaepernick. We see that so many times. We've seen that with, and I'm not even going to speak on him, but we see that in clothing and apparel and things like this as well. We see this in entertainment with music. We see this in entertainment with movies. If once we start relying upon ourselves and once we start supporting ourselves, the sky's the limit. And we can't rely upon anyone else besides people who look like us. It's great to have support from outsiders, but we have to start from within. And that is the most beautiful thing about our people, is that we have the ability to do so and work with little resources and build things up and build communities from the ground up and build just these beautiful, affluent communities and build businesses and create generational wealth and create wealth, period. Create assets, create liabilities, and create all these things for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The most unfortunate thing, other than the lives that were lost, other than the businesses that were lost in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 100 years ago, was what they were working towards. And that was this generational wealth thing that I keep speaking about. Because had these businesses have been passed down, they may have taken over most of Oklahoma had they have been able to. And that's what the threat was. That had they moved out of this district, they were going to take over that. And I know I'm kind of like all over the place with the episode. I don't have a list of things and topics I want to hit. I'm literally just going on the top of my head, and we're already 40 minutes in. But that's really all I have, man. Do your research. There's many more massacres to read up on, but we should be more read up on things like this. We should know our history. We should know where we came from. We should know so we can know where we can go. I know that sounds cliche, but it is very important. Before I do get out of here, my what to watch for this week: watch Tulsa Burning on History Channel if you have it. Watch Dreamland on CNN if you have it. Watch The Legacy of Tulsa, Oklahoma, or the Legacy of Black Wall Street on if you have it. And the last one, it was 1921 Tulsa Massacre, I believe, on CBS. These are all great documentaries that covers what I just spoke about. If you want something that's like non-fictional, or you want something that's fictional, or non-fictional is, I forget what's the difference. But definitely watch episode 9 of Lovecraft Country if you have HBO Max. Watch the first episode of The Watchmen on HBO Max. Both great episodes. Both visually depict what I believe this scene to have looked like. There's definitely probably other topics that I should have covered and that I'm missing right now that I will come back and cover. But I may just give you all 2 episodes this week. But for the time being, thank you all for tuning into the Speak One Piece podcast. Make sure you are subscribing to the Speak One Piece podcast. You're on YouTube, subscribe, share. Same thing with Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher, wherever the case may be. I definitely appreciate all you tuning in to the Speak One Piece podcast. And that's all I have. That's the Speak One Piece podcast for this week. I'm out.